evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight we have a major news alert out of Arizona tonight that pertains to that state's statewide election. We'll tell you what that is in just a minute. But first up, for the second time in living memory, there was an election recount crisis in the state of Florida tonight. Just last week, as you'll remember, Republicans Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis defeated Democrats Bill Nelson and Andrew Gillum in the Senate and gubernatorial races there. The results seemed to be conclusive at the time. They were reported on this and every other news channel on election night last Tuesday. And yet just 6 days later, it is very possible that both those Democrats will win the seats, the ones that just the other day they had lost. How did that happen exactly? Well, thousands of new and uncounted ballots appeared in Florida, mostly in Democratic-leaning counties. And those ballots changed the results sufficiently to trigger a statewide recount. That recount is underway right now. The process so far is not inspiring confidence in the system. President Trump has complained about it, as have plenty of other people, including some journalists and Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. But it turns out that complaining about this is not allowed. So to restate the rules, in case you've forgotten, when a Republican wins an election, it is fine to question the legitimacy of the process. Democrats have been doing that since the very day Trump was elected 2 years ago. That is patriotic. It's your duty. But when the Democratic Party's power is at stake, raising any question at all about the process is wrong. Indeed, it's nothing less than the road to dictatorship. Watch.
He's basically trying to undermine at every turn. It's not just Florida. He weighed in on Arizona. He's weighed in on other races. He's undermining the legitimacy of elections.
Where he doesn't like the results.
Where he doesn't like the results. And that is a hallmark of a failing democracy, of someone moving towards an authoritarian.
He's authoritarian, scream the authoritarians. Meanwhile, defending the results of elections that have already been called is now the same as overturning elections. Listen to incoming House Speaker Nancy Pelosi explain how this works.
The president has been saying that there's election fraud in Florida. What do you think is happening in Broward County?
My experience with the president is anytime he charges somebody with something, he's just projecting what he might have done himself. We are not engaged.
Election fraud?
Well, obstruction, suppression of the vote.
Suppression. Nancy Pelosi did not use that word accidentally. The term is meant to evoke images of a darker time in American history, a time of night riders and burning crosses, a time very few living Americans remember personally, but that lives in our collective memory. This kind of talk can be politically useful. That's why they do it. That's why it's a theme on the left, in case you haven't noticed. In Broward County, for example, ballot counting is overseen by a woman called Brenda Snipes. Snipes was previously caught illegally destroying ballots. This time around, she's apparently mixed invalid provisional ballots with valid ones. That sounds bad. But don't dare criticize Snipes for the way she does her job. According to MSNBC, the only relevant fact about Brenda Snipes is the color of her skin. Watch.
Here is the way they are treating Brenda Snipes, who is the longtime election supervisor there, who, by the way, is an older black woman in the Deep South. Okay, just keep that in mind as you watch this video.
If you look at the person, in this case a woman, involved, she has had a horrible history.
So in case you're wondering what demagoguery looks like, you just saw it. But why now? Why are they doing this now? Democrats are acting like they've been robbed of power somehow. And yet in elections just last week that all of us saw, Democrats gained power. They retook the House of Representatives after 8 years. They added several governorships. They nearly broke even in the Senate. That was not enough, though. They want more, and they will use any means necessary to get it. In Palm Beach County, the county canvassing board disqualified a vote because it was cast by a non-citizen. Non-citizens are not allowed to vote in federal elections. It is illegal. It also never happens in this country, ever. We're told that again and again, and anyone who disagrees is racist. But in this case, it actually did happen. Nobody disputes that. The Democrats' response to this happening? Attorneys for Gillum and Nelson said the vote should not be disqualified. They objected to the disqualification because the only thing that matters to them in the end is winning. It's easy to find yourself thinking like this if you believe politics is holy war. To a religious extremist, an election is not a contest between fellow Americans who disagree on policy. It's an existential battle between good and evil. Evil must be vanquished at all costs, no matter what. Kirsten Gillibrand has reached this conclusion. Now, Senator Gillibrand is not an obvious candidate for America's leading moral voice. She was a longtime friend and defender of Harvey Weinstein's, for example. But listen to her now, preaching like it's the last Sunday in Lent.
Are you staying in the Senate, or are you going to run for president?
I've been thinking about it because, as we said earlier, what President Trump has been putting into this country is so disturbing, so divisive, so dark, that I believe that I've been called to fight as hard as I possibly can to restore that moral integrity, that moral decency.
That sounds like a yes.
So I'm thinking about it.
Moral integrity, moral decency. That's what Democrats are telling you they are defending. And if you think about it for a minute, that is worrisome. People who know how deeply flawed they are tend not to overreach. They have humility. But when you're a holy warrior on a mission from God, what won't you do? Craig Patrick is political editor and chief investigator at WTVT Fox in Tampa Bay, and he joins us tonight with the very latest on this story. What is the state of play as of right now in this recount?
It's a mess. You have a growing list of blunders and gaffes on both sides. Yes, Bill Nelson is still trailing Rick Scott by some 12,500 votes. It would be unprecedented that he would catch up, but they're continuing the process. It's day 2. I want to come back to something you said because it illustrates the problem in Southeast Florida and the kinds of blunders we've seen. When we say they mixed provisional ballots, the canvassing board had gone through to determine which ones they wanted to accept, which ones they wanted to reject, and then after that, jumbled some of them together, saying, oops, we got them mixed up. Now we don't know which one is which. It's an example of the kind of blunders we've seen not just this year, but in years prior. And when you combine that with Broward County election managers saying they didn't know or wouldn't say how many ballots they still have to count days after the election, and now they're saying, and Palm Beach County, too, they need more time. They don't see how they can complete a machine recount by Thursday, while some counties are already there or very close to it. When you look at all of these things, it's easy to see how people outside of Florida can look at this and say, nobody can be this stupid. There must be something nefarious going on here. To which those of us who have covered Florida for some length of time say, have you met the election managers in South Florida? That operation has been a rolling calamity for years, mistake after mistake, and it takes something like 3 different statewide races being affected for it to rise to the level that it currently has and get the scrutiny that it deserves. And at the same time, this is playing out in the Democratic strongholds. You now have a controversy in North Florida, in Bay County, a Republican stronghold where the election supervisor there decided to allow email voting because you had victims of Hurricane Michael, wanted to make it as easy as he possibly could for people to vote. The problem is that was not included in the governor's executive order to loosen some of the restrictions. So Democrats are looking at this and saying, if you're looking for evidence of illegal voting activity, look to North Florida, not to Southeast Florida. And with that, you're getting this tit for tat. And they're saying, look, had that same courtesy been extended of email voting statewide, the results could have been different. So you're getting a lot of woulda, coulda, shoulda, and it's coming from both sides. Lawsuits are flying. And this is just day 2 of the recount. Much more to come.
That's an amazing report. Craig, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Katherine Harris was, of course, a figure from history. She was the Secretary of State in Florida during the 2000 presidential recount, and she joins us tonight. Katherine Harris, thanks very much for coming on tonight. So,
Tucker, thank you for having me.
For those of us who are not familiar with the intricacies of election law, the most basic question first, how could thousands of uncounted ballots appear after the polls close?
Okay, Tucker, we're a nation of laws. Rule of law is the most important bedrock in our country,
Yes.
and no one can wax eloquently more than you on that subject. But the most important aspect of these elected supervisors of elections in each county, I think we have a basic expectation that they're going to operate with courage and integrity. Funny that you have to say courage when following the law, but this is a critical issue that they follow the law as it's written, not as they want it to be. And so how ballots show up late, they're going to have to explain that because there's a chain of custody. All those issues will come up as a result.
But having watched this very carefully, and no one's watched it more carefully than you have, does that produce alarm bells in your head when you see someone show up in what appears to be a settled election with a box of ballots saying these haven't been counted? Do you wonder, what is this?
Of course you do. Of course you do. And that all is supposed to be recorded, documented. There were supposed to be updates during the course of the election and certainly afterwards that Palm Beach and Broward have failed to perform. So what's going to happen is there are laws that must be followed. There are laws according to who is an eligible voter. So if someone is a felon in this election, their vote is not counted. If someone is an illegal alien, they're not allowed to determine Florida's future or the future of our nation. Their vote will not be counted. If absentee ballot signature doesn't match up with the absentee ballot on record, they're allowed to count that vote. It's the same as a bank. You wouldn't be able to cash a check.
Right.
And so these are all the issues they're going to have to deal with. They have to follow the rule of law and the law in the state of Florida. Actually, our election laws are sufficient to handle this. It's just a matter of people are breaking them or not.
What's so interesting is, given all the scrutiny that your state came under 18 years ago in the recount, to see someone in charge of recording votes in a county in Southeast Florida with a documented record of screwing it up in the most obvious ways, illegally destroying ballots, how could that person still be in charge of ballot counting?
So in Florida, the supervisor of elections in each of the 67 counties are constitutional officers. They are elected by their counties. They cannot be removed by the Secretary of State. So there is a background, clearly, that she has. I was not involved in the case.
Right.
But only the governor can remove her for cause for those actions.
I mean, this is a subjective question, but you might be someone who could answer it. How politicized is the election process in your or other states, honestly?
So honestly, as Secretary of State, when I was there, you have the media, you have your different parties that are so active, but the Office of Secretary of State in Division of Elections was not politicized. In fact, we shut it down. Republican operatives or Democrats could not come in. We met with the heads of both party initially, and then we actually hired a Democrat constitutional lawyer to come in and advise our attorneys in-house to make sure that we were following the letter of the law. We made certain that the process was going to follow the law. That was our only safe harbor. And my encouragement or my advice to these supervisors of elections would be that they must follow the law. No matter what they do, half the people are going to be very unhappy with them. But their only safe harbor is to follow the law.
Catherine Harris, it must give you vertigo to watch all this. I bet you're glad you're not involved this time around.
Well,
Thank you.
It does seem like deja vu all over again, Tucker.
I can't even imagine. Thank you for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Another man whose name you will recognize if you followed the history of this stuff, Kendall Coffey. He served as Al Gore's attorney during the 2000 recount. Harmeet Dillon serves on the board of the Republican National Lawyers Association, and both of them join us tonight. Thank you both very much for coming on. Kendall Coffey, first to you. There may be something that is missing in the translation here, but you have what appeared to be a pretty straightforward case of ineligible voting in Florida, where someone who was not a U.S. citizen voted in a federal election, and the lawyer, both for the Democratic candidate for governor and the Democratic candidate for senator, both of them objected to disqualifying that vote. On what grounds would they do that?
No grounds. It was a bad idea. It certainly wasn't embraced by the legal teams, much less by the candidates. When you get thousands of volunteers happening in a case, some of them are going to say things they never should have said. This was something that was immediately disowned, should never happen, but it was one non-vote in an election where there are 8 million votes that have been cast. So it's pretty darn remote and insignificant in the context of things.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll find out. Do you think, Harmeet, that, I mean, what struck me about this is that I've been told many times on this show that that doesn't happen at all, and I don't know the extent to which it does. Does it happen a lot? Should we be worried about the integrity of our elections?
Oh, of course we should. I think this example shows it, and the Democrats are employing a scorched earth policy here. I mean, they reflexively think every vote should be counted, whether it is legally cast, legally received, legally matches up with the signature on record or the county on record or not. And that's not what our system of laws is, as Catherine Harris just mentioned. Just as an example, Tucker, in Arizona, in the election that was just concluded, there were 1,470 registrations by aliens in just one county there. So those are people who signed up and said, I want to vote in this election. That's one county. That absolutely happens all over the country. And it is a serious issue that Democrats don't want us looking into, because most of those votes are going to be going that way.
So, Kendall Coffey, I think that every valid vote should be counted, and I think we should do all we can to make sure that every vote is counted. Obviously, that's democracy. But what is the answer to the question, where do these votes come from after the polls have closed? And we think all the votes have been counted, and then somebody shows up with a box and says, here are new votes. Shouldn't we find out why those votes weren't counted? What is that, I guess is my question.
There should be an explanation. I think what the supervisors will say is they're running around all day in a very intense election trying to deal with things. A lot of ballots come in on the day of election by 7 p.m. There's a huge amount of late-breaking interest in this midterm and a lot of late-arriving ballots. Could it have been handled? Should it have been handled better in terms of informing the public about the status of votes? Absolutely. But the reality is that Broward got their votes in on time Saturday. We have a recount process that was created by Republican legislators, rules for recounting that are very well specifically drawn by Republican administrations, and a state supervisor of election and secretary of state that have been Republican appointees for the last 20 years. And yes, they've been paying attention to Brenda Snipes and every part of this election.
So, but I want to ask you about that, Harmeet. Brenda Snipes, is a name I have not heard before, and I'm not here to attack Brenda Snipes, but I wonder when any question about Brenda Snipes' handling of this is dismissed as a racial attack, I wonder maybe if that's not, a diversion designed to get us not to pay attention to what Brenda Snipes is doing. Do you think there's cause for concern in that specific case?
Tucker, I am here to attack Brenda Snipes. She absolutely deserves to be attacked, and her behavior here has been outrageous, cavalier. It required a court order to allow reporters and observers back in to watch the counting there. Contrary to what Kendall just said, they actually did try to count ballots after Saturday noon deadline, so they have attempted to do that. They have mixed in ballots. They have been observed filling in circles in her county of undercount ballots as well. So I think her behavior is outrageous. I'm wondering why, given this repeated pattern of conduct, the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Election Section has not opened up an investigation into this. I mean, this is a repeated pattern of behavior there. And, just like you said, with regard to her gender and her race being pointed out, the same exact arguments are being used in Georgia on behalf of Stacey Abrams. Like, oh, why would you attack her and question her? She's a woman of color. What does that have to do with it? It has zero to do with it. And the Democrats are really kind of undermining their own arguments with these silly appeals to labels.
Well, these ultimately seem like math questions, and I hope we can solve them in a rational way. Thank you both very much for that. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Tucker.
We've got a Fox News alert for you tonight. Republican Martha McSally has conceded the Senate race in Arizona, the one that she thought she won. The new senator from that state will be Kyrsten Sinema. McSally led on election night, but a surge of late-counted votes carried Sinema to the lead. Independent Women's Voice senior fellow Lisa Booth has been following this race since its earliest stages and joins us tonight to explain exactly what happened. Lisa Booth, what exactly, if you could bottom line what happened in this election that Martha McSally and everyone watching thought she won, but now she just conceded she's not going to be the new senator, what happened?
Right, and as you mentioned, the Associated Press has called the race. She has conceded. I think the problem largely looks like Maricopa County. This Maricopa County represents about 60% of the state's population.
Yeah.
It's Republican leading, but Sinema has actually been leading there. That's where these new votes came in from tonight that really put her over the top, which is why the Associated Press ended up calling the race. However, I would also think about the fact that Martha McSally might have a chance of trying to get elected as a senator in Arizona looking at 2020, because remember, Senator Kyle is really a placeholder for the late Senator John McCain. So she could potentially eye that race in 2020. Whoever wins that special election in 2020 would then have to run again in 2022. So she might be someone, that wants to throw her name in the hat for that race.
Well, for sure. It's interesting, though. I just read an analysis, and it was on 538, not a right-wing site, that said between 2000 and 2015, every single recount statewide that changed an election result changed it in the Democrats' favor, every single one. So that doesn't prove anything, but you got to ask the obvious question. And the obvious question in this case is, Martha McSally is satisfied that this process was fair?
Well, she conceded. So, it'll be interesting to see what articles or what surfaces this week, if there are any articles that, draw any attention to anything nefarious that went on in any of these counties, or particularly Maricopa County. But as of right now, she has conceded So I guess not enough for her to, to not concede, right?
Can I just ask one more quick dumb question? So we keep seeing these races where they get called and all the news organizations, ours and every other, says we know who the winner is. And then we find out, oh, wait, there are all these votes who haven't been counted.
Right.
Why don't secretaries of state alert the public and the candidates and us that actually we're not really sure because we haven't counted all the votes? Has that occurred to anybody to do that?
That's a good point, Tucker. And we've also got that going on in Georgia right now because that race still hasn't been called. We should know more information tomorrow. Tomorrow, the deadline is 5 p.m. for counties to certify the results and get those to the Secretary of State. However, Stacey Abrams has, 2 lawsuits pending, one trying to move that deadline to Wednesday, and she's also trying to get absentee ballots that have been thrown out counted. So
we are on that. We will see you again, Lisa Booth.
Okay, thank you, Tucker. Have a great night.
Hillary Clinton could run for president in 2020. One of her former close advisors is saying that. Mark Stein joins us after the break. Tell us what that might mean. Stay tuned. Say Hillary Clinton is no artist, but the creativity she's displayed in explaining the reasons that she lost to Trump in 2016, remarkable.
The use of my email account was turned into, the biggest scandal since Lord knows when. They covered it like it was Pearl Harbor. If you look at Facebook, the vast majority of the news items posted were fake. There's all these stories about, guys over in Macedonia who are running these fake news sites. I inherit nothing from the Democratic Party. I also think I was the victim of a very broad assumption I was going to win.
We could spend the entire hour playing tapes of all the various ways the election was stolen from her. Anything to avoid confronting the real reasons, apparently. Well, now, longtime advisor to Hillary Clinton, Mark Penn, says that she may indeed try again, a third run at the White House in 2020.
A lot of Democrats think she was unfairly denied winning the last presidential race. She's a pro, and she learns, and Clintons never stop until they get where they want to go, and I say don't count her out.
Author and columnist Mark Stein joins us tonight. So Mark, so we're treating this like it's crazy. I know both you and I are thinking this is insane, but why is it insane actually? She is the standard bearer for the Democratic Party. It was stolen from her by the Macedonian data farms. We've agreed on that for a long time. Why wouldn't she be the presumptive nominee? Seriously, right now.
Well, I do think it makes a lot of sense. If the 2020 election were to be a rerun of Hillary versus Trump, when the Florida Democrats decide to steal it, then the Broward and Palm Beach County guys will already have the 2016 ballots sitting around in the cupboard, so they won't have to stay up all night running the photocopier as they are at the moment. So it does have a lot to commend it. And Hillary's rationale that she lost because everybody was expecting her to win. She's like I think it was the Yogi Berra joke that it's whatever the line was. It's such a popular restaurant, nobody goes there. And that's basically the Hillary campaign. But she's convinced that the third time will be the charm. And I don't rule her out because compared to Bernie and Joe Biden, she has the bloom of youth upon her.
What would she run on? What she ran on last time? Vote for me or you're immoral?
Well, I think she should actually go back to where she was in the early 90s when she was the crazy left-winger who believed in universal health care. Then she became the centrist Senate candidate. Then she ran last time as basically this kleptocrat who was raking in the big bucks from Kazakh oligarchs and various Saudi princes. So basically, the Democrat Party has slid to where she was circa 1992. You can see why she's kind of annoyed that she doesn't get the credit for that.
No, that's such a good point. And do you remember that? I mean, you were around. I was too. People thought that she was really left-wing before she went full-blown corporate Walmart board member, apologist for big tech. If she returned to that, she might have a shot. For real.
Yeah, no, she was. If you remember, she was, I mean, people don't remember this, but her mentor was Jessica Mitford of the English Mitford sisters, who was the left-wing communist Mitford sister. So then she moves to the center, becomes one of these third-way Democrats. Then she becomes, as I said, one of these kleptocrat, centrist Democrats. Meanwhile, the party all has slid to the left because all the romance is on the far left. And I do think, in fairness to her, that as stiff and incompetent and incapable of connecting with the voters as she is, that she's learned her lessons from last time. Last time, Trump's Russian pals bought $100,000 worth of Facebook ads and stole the election from her. So she figures if she can get a Kazakh warlord to give her 200 grand to spend Facebook ads on, she can steal the 2020 election back from the Macedonian content farmers, and it will be justice.
When she shows up with a Che Guevara t-shirt, we'll know she's taking your advice. Mark Stein, great to see you.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Democrats just retook the House. It'll be official in January. First order of business, waging war on the president with the subpoena cannon. What does that mean exactly? Details after the break. Control the House of Representatives after 8 years. And there's a lot of things they could do with that new power. They might even collaborate with the president on a few things, fighting the heroin epidemic, for example, or repairing our crumbling infrastructure. But for incoming Intel Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, there is another priority, helping powerful tech companies, to which he is totally beholden. President Trump has been pressuring the Postal Service to hike rates on Amazon, which he says is getting unfairly low rates and shafting taxpayers. Schiff is outraged, though, that anyone might complain about this, might complain that the world's richest man is exploiting the United States and ripping off taxpayers on postal rates. In fact, he thinks that criticism is likely a crime worthy of an investigation. That's not the only crime that Schiff sees. He also wants to investigate the Trump administration's opposition to AT&T's $85 billion takeover of Time Warner because CNN is owned by Time Warner. That's what the left-wing resistance is becoming, a platform for protecting the world's most powerful corporations. In fact, that's what it's always been. Well, defending powerful tech monopolies may be a top Democratic concern, but it's not their only one. Democrats say they're preparing a subpoena cannon that will target nearly 100 different Trump-related targets, from his tax returns to Jared Kushner to the implementation of the travel ban, the proposed ban on transgenders in the military, etc. What are voters going to think of that? Julian Epstein is former chief counsel of Democrats in the House Judiciary Committee. He joins us tonight. So, Julian, thanks a lot for coming on. I think we both agree that the Congress does have a constitutional responsibility of oversight. I think we probably also agree that Republicans have done a lot of foolish nonsense like this, too, over the years. Conceded. They also just lost the House.
We agree.
Right. So,
we agree on three things.
Yeah. So my question is, though, does investigating the president's meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki last summer, is that going to lower health insurance rates at all, do you think?
Well, we also agree that I think Democrats should look to work with Republicans on a whole host of things. I think in particular, last time I was on the show, we agreed that both political parties for the last couple of decades have ignored the middle class. And the middle class has had an economic recession since about 1975, and neither party has really put forward a meaningful agenda to address the middle class and the working class. So I completely agree with you on that, and I completely agree that both parties are guilty of not doing that. As far as investigations, I think we've learned something from the many investigations over the last 20, 25 years. Benghazi and Fast and Furious and the investigations Democrats did into Iraq when the Democrats were in control from 2006 to 2010. And that is, in order for an investigation to be successful, it's got to be bipartisan. You've got to work with the other side, and you've got to make a compelling case, not just to the other party, but to the American public, that you're not trying to score political points. What you're doing is the people's business, the constitutional duty, as you allude to it,
I agree.
to do meaningful oversight, to make sure people are playing by the rules. As far as a subpoena cannon, on the two committees that I was a staff director of the Government Oversight Committee and then chief counsel of Judiciary, we got into a lot of subpoena fights. The one thing that I think a lot of people on the left don't realize, and I think Jerry Nadler and some of the others are proper in chastening people on the left a little bit, is that subpoenas are exceedingly difficult to enforce. You remember Fast and Furious in 2011 and 2012?
Very well.
There was a subpoena for the Justice Department documents. There was a fight back and forth. That went on for about 3 years before House Republicans finally gave up on it. It's incredibly difficult. The courts insist that the two branches, the legislative branch and the executive branch, exhaust all the options before they go to the courts to try and enforce a subpoena. Even then, you can have endless appeals. And the executive branch can run the clock. And that's all the more important that if the Democratic investigations are going to be effective, they are, one, going to have to appeal to the sense of kind of civic duty on part of Republicans to play a meaningful role and make the case to the public that this is not about scoring points against Trump. This is not about trying to win the election in 2020. This is about meaningful and important oversight that there should be bipartisan agreement on.
If they can do that, I'll be impressed. Julian Epstein, thank you. As always,
I certainly am urging them to do that.
Yeah, well, I hope they listen. They never will, but I hope they do. Thank you. Well, the French president just attacked our president for backing something dangerous called nationalism. Is this country suffering from too much nationalism or too little? What is nationalism anyway? One of the world's experts on the subject joins us next.
Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism by saying, our interests first, who cares about the others? We erase what a nation holds dearest.
That was the French president making an oblique and hard to understand and therefore incredibly French point. It was, of course, a criticism of Donald Trump. It came during the commemorations of World War I in France, the 100-year anniversary of the armistice. President Trump has called himself a nationalist. He said that right before the midterm election. He was vilified for that in this country. But if you take a deep breath, you have to ask yourself, in an increasingly fractured America, could it be that we need more nationalism and not less? Nicholas Giordano is a professor of political science at Suffolk Community College, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thanks a lot for coming on. Tell us what nationalism actually is. If you could sum it up as crisply as you can, what is nationalism?
Hi, Tucker. Nationalism is important because it's what links us together as a country. We are a nation state. And so when you're looking at the concept of nationalism, it's the acceptance of the American creed, the tenets of the American creed, as well as it helps us to motivate us to help our country. Nationalism is one of the most important concepts out there. Macron's just wrong. It's as simple as that.
Well, so, I mean, the knock against nationalism is that there's something racially exclusive or racist about it. Is it inherently a racial creed? Does it have anything to do with race?
No, it doesn't. What nationalism does, it fosters the democratic consciousness. And that's an important point that people get wrong. We have a stake in the system. We are the legitimate authority over the system as the people of the United States. Prior to nationalism, loyalty was to one leader. Now it's to the country as a whole, and nationalism fosters patriotism. In my classroom, I use Hurricane Harvey as a great example. During Harvey, you had citizens affected by the hurricane took their own boats, their private boats, and they went and they helped out their fellow citizens. They didn't say this is the black boat and the white boat's 15 minutes behind us. They didn't say this is the Republican boat or the Democrat boat. They were just out there to help Americans, and that's what nationalism fosters. If you look at countries without nationalism, nationalism defeats tribalism. So Afghanistan, Libya, those countries are where tribalism is enforced. There's no loyalty to the country of Afghanistan as a whole or Libya as a whole. And that's why those countries have been engaged in tribal warfare for the last 3,000 years.
It's so nicely put, what you just said. And it also, now that you say it, it's such an obvious point. Why would there be such a loud caucus against nationalism, against national unity?
Well, I think there's two things going on. When you look at someone like President Macron of France, I think he likes the idea of transnationalism, trying to replace the idea of nationalism with this regional nationalism. And then for other people, if we look at the United States, the people that say that nationalism is a bad thing or nationalism is racist, I think they just aren't necessarily proud of the country that the United States is. They focus on all the bad that the United States has done. And they don't look at the positives of how the United States has actually changed the world.
Well, exactly. Professor, that was such a nice explanation. I hope you'll join us again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's been a tough week. It's been a tough year. And when things get tough, we break the glass in case of emergency and invite on Mike Rowe. And this time we're going all out. He is bringing his mother. So what is she doing with him on our set tonight? You will find out after the break.
Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism by saying, our interests first, who cares about the others? We erase what a nation holds dearest.
That was the French president making an oblique and hard to understand and therefore incredibly French point. It was, of course, a criticism of Donald Trump. It came during the commemorations of World War I in France, the 100-year anniversary of the armistice. President Trump has himself called himself a nationalist. He said that right before the midterm election. He was vilified for that in this country. But if you take a deep breath, you have to ask yourself, in an increasingly fractured America, could it be that we need more nationalism and not less? Nicholas Giordano is a professor of political science at Suffolk Community College, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thanks a lot for coming on. Tell us what nationalism actually is. If you could sum it up as crisply as you can, what is nationalism?
Hi, Tucker. Nationalism is important because it's what links us together as a country. We are a nation state. And so when you're looking at the concept of nationalism, it's the acceptance of the American creed, the tenets of the American creed, as well as it helps us to motivate us to help our country. Nationalism is one of the most important concepts out there, and Macron's just wrong. It's as simple as that.
Well, so, I mean, the knock against nationalism is that there's something racially exclusive or racist about it. Is it inherently a racial creed? Does it have anything to do with race?
No, it doesn't. What nationalism does, it fosters the democratic consciousness. And that's an important point that people get wrong. We have a stake in the system. We are the legitimate authority over the system as the people of the United States. Prior to nationalism, loyalty was to one leader. Now it's to the country as a whole, and nationalism fosters patriotism. In my classroom, I use Hurricane Harvey as a great example. During Harvey, you had people citizens affected by the hurricane took their own boats, their private boats, and they went and they helped out their fellow citizens. They didn't say this is the black boat and the white boat's 15 minutes behind us. They didn't say this is the Republican boat or the Democrat boat. They were just out there to help Americans, and that's what nationalism fosters. If you look at countries without nationalism, nationalism defeats tribalism. So Afghanistan, Libya, those countries are where tribalism is in force. There's no loyalty to the country of Afghanistan as a whole or Libya as a whole. And that's why those countries have been engaged in tribal warfare for the last 3,000 years.
It's so nicely put, what you just said. And it also, now that you say it, it's such an obvious point. Why would there be such a loud caucus against nationalism, against national unity?
Well, I think there's two things going on. When you look at someone like President Macron of France, I think he likes the idea of transnationalism, trying to replace the idea of nationalism with this regional nationalism. And then for other people, if we look at the United States, the people that say that nationalism is a bad thing or nationalism is racist, I think they just aren't necessarily proud of the country that the United States is. They focus on all the bad that the United States has done. And they don't look at the positives of how the United States has actually changed the world.
Well, exactly. Professor, that was such a nice explanation. I hope you'll join us again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's been a tough week. It's been a tough year. And when things get tough, we break the glass in case of emergency and invite on Mike Rowe. And this time we're going all out. He is bringing his mother. So what is she doing with him on our set tonight? You will find out after the break.
Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism by saying, our interests first, who cares about the others? We erase what a nation holds dearest.
That was the French president making an oblique and hard to understand and therefore incredibly French point. It was, of course, a criticism of Donald Trump. It came during the commemorations of World War I in France, the 100-year anniversary of the armistice. President Trump has himself called himself a nationalist. He said that right before the midterm election. He was vilified for that in this country. But if you take a deep breath, you have to ask yourself, in an increasingly fractured America, could it be that we need more nationalism and not less. Nicholas Giordano is a professor of political science at Suffolk Community College, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thanks a lot for coming on. Tell us what nationalism actually is. If you could sum it up as crisply as you can, what is nationalism?
Hi, Tucker. Nationalism is important because it's what links us together as a country. We are a nation state. And so when you're looking at the concept of nationalism, it's the acceptance of the American creed, the tenets of the American creed, as well as it helps us to motivate us to help our country. Nationalism is one of the most important concepts out there. Macron's just wrong. It's as simple as that.
Well, so, I mean, the knock against nationalism is that there's something racially exclusive or racist about it. Is it inherently a racial creed? Does it have anything to do with race?
No, it doesn't. What nationalism does, it fosters the democratic consciousness. And that's an important point that people get wrong. We have a stake in the system. We are the legitimate authority over the system as the people of the United States. Prior to nationalism, loyalty was to one leader. Now it's to the country as a whole, and nationalism fosters patriotism. In my classroom, I use Hurricane Harvey as a great example.